He dropped out at 17. Epilepsy, no diploma, no connections. Today, his face reaches screens in countries that have never set foot in Las Vegas. But behind every deal closed on camera lies a story the cameras never showed. Of broken family, buried grief, and losses no fortune could bargain away. How did he build all of this? And what did it truly cost him? Rick Harrison was not born into the spotlight. He was born into uncertainty. On March 22, 1970, in Lexington, North Carolina, Richard Benjamin Harrison entered a world that would spend the next 2 decades testing him in ways most people never survive with their spirit intact. His father, Richard Harrison Sr., the man the world would one day know simply as the Old Man, was a career Navy officer, disciplined, stoic, and deeply traditional. A man who believed that hardship was not something to escape, but something to endure, absorb, and eventually use. Because of his father's military postings, Rick's childhood was a relentless series of uprooting. New cities, new schools, new faces that never had enough time to become friends before the next move arrived. For most children, school is the one constant. For Rick, even that was taken away. Over and over. Just as he began to find his footing in a classroom, the family packed up and disappeared again, leaving behind whatever fragile sense of belonging he had started to build. But the transient life of a military family was not the deepest wound Rick carried into childhood. That wound had a name: epilepsy. At 8 years old, Rick Harrison had his first seizure. The world went dark without warning, his body betraying him in the most terrifying and public of ways. In an instant, the boy who already struggled to fit in became the boy others stared at, whispered about, and quietly avoided. Epilepsy in the 1970s was not spoken about with the understanding it commands today. It was feared, misunderstood, and for a child already moving from school to school with no roots and no anchor, it became one more reason to feel fundamentally different from everyone around him. The seizures disrupted everything. Reading became a battlefield. Concentration fractured. Classroom environments that were already foreign became almost hostile. Teachers didn't always know how to help. Peers didn't always know how to respond. And Rick, proud and quietly fierce even then, refused to ask for either. What he did instead would define the rest of his life. He read. Not textbooks assigned by schools that barely knew his name. He read everything else: history, philosophy, economics, military strategy, biographies of men and women who had built things from nothing. While his classmates memorized what they were told to memorize, Rick Harrison was quietly constructing an education entirely his own. Page by page, book by book, in whatever corner of whatever temporary home the family occupied at the time. It was not the education a system would recognize, but it was, in every way that mattered, the education that would eventually make him extraordinary. By his teenage years, the Harrison family had settled in Las Vegas, Nevada, a city that runs on illusion, on the promise that ordinary people can become extraordinary overnight. Rick saw through that promise almost immediately. He was not built for gambling. He was built for negotiation, for reading people, for understanding value where others saw only surface. But the school system had already rendered its verdict on Rick Harrison. A teenager with epilepsy, a fractured academic record, and a restlessness that no classroom could contain, he dropped out of high school at 17. To the world looking in, it was failure. To Rick, it was simply the moment he stopped pretending that the path being offered was ever meant for him. His father, watching his son step away from formal education, did not rage. He offered something else instead, a choice. Come work. Learn by doing. Learn by losing. Learn by surviving. In 1988, Richard Harrison Sr. opened the gold and silver pawn shop on Las Vegas Boulevard. It was not a glamorous beginning. The neighborhood was rough. The hours were brutal. The clientele arrived carrying desperation more often than treasure. People walked through those doors because they had nowhere else to go, because the rent was due, or the lights had been cut off, or because something had gone wrong in a life that had already seen too many things go wrong. Rick stood behind that counter and watched, listened, learned. Every object that crossed the glass had a story beneath its price. Every customer was a negotiation waiting to happen. And in that gritty, unglamorous pawn shop on the edge of Las Vegas, the boy who had been told by circumstance that he did not belong anywhere began, slowly and deliberately, to build the one place where he absolutely did. The cameras were still years away. The fame was unimaginable. But the foundation was already being laid. Not with privilege or connections, but with the one currency Rick Harrison had always possessed in surplus: the stubborn, relentless refusal to quit. The gold and silver pawn shop was never supposed to be a dynasty. In the beginning, it was barely a business. The early years behind that counter were a relentless education in failure. Rick Harrison was 18 years old when he first began to truly understand what it meant to run a business on the margins. Not from textbooks, not from lectures, but from the grinding, unglamorous reality of watching the month's numbers fall short, watching desperate customers walk in with objects worth far less than their hope, and watching his father's face carry the quiet strain of a man who had bet his family's stability on an idea that the world had not yet agreed to believe in. Las Vegas, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, was a city of extremes. Obscene wealth on one side of the street, quiet devastation on the other. Now, the gold and silver pawn shop existed firmly in the middle, serving the people the casinos had already emptied. Rick learned early that pawn was not a glamorous trade. It was a trade built on other people's misfortune, and navigating that reality with both honesty and business sense required a particular kind of emotional intelligence that no school could have taught him. But the business was only one battlefield. His personal life was opening its own front. Rick married young. His first marriage, to Kim Harrison, came with the kind of optimism that only youth can sustain. Together, they had 2 sons, Corey, who would one day stand beside his father under the lights of a television set, and Adam. But the weight of a struggling business, the relentless hours, the financial uncertainty that clung to every month like smoke, began to erode what love alone could not hold together. The marriage collapsed. And Rick Harrison, still only in his 20s, found himself simultaneously trying to save a business and rebuild the wreckage of a family structure he had wanted desperately to get right. He had not forgotten what it felt like to grow up without roots. He did not want his sons to inherit that particular wound. The guilt of a failed marriage layered itself over the stress of financial survival. There were months when the pawn shop teetered on the edge. Months when the bills stacked against the glass cases that held other people's valuables, and Rick stood behind them wondering if the whole thing was about to come apart. He later admitted that there were periods where he genuinely did not know if the business would survive the week, let alone the decade. Yet what kept him standing was not confidence, it was calculation. Rick Harrison had spent years reading, studying, absorbing knowledge that formal education had never offered him. Now, behind that counter, he began to apply it with ruthless precision. He studied the objects people brought in with the obsession of a scholar. Coins, watches, weapons, art, military memorabilia, historical artifacts. He taught himself to identify value that others could not see, to negotiate from a position of knowledge rather than intuition, and to build a reputation in a city built on fleeting reputations as someone who dealt straight. Word spread slowly, then faster. The gold and silver began to attract a different kind of customer. Not only the desperate, but the curious. Collectors, historians, people who had inherited objects they did not understand and trusted Rick to tell them the truth. That trust became the foundation on which everything else would eventually be built. He married again, this time to Tracy, with whom he would have his youngest son, Jake. The second marriage brought a period of greater stability, a renewed sense of what he was working toward. But the hours remained brutal. The pressure remained constant, and the distance between who Rick was at work and who his family needed him to be at home was a gap he never fully knew how to close. It is the cost that ambitious men rarely calculate in advance, the price paid not by the builder himself, but by the people who love the builder and learn, slowly, that they will always share him with something larger than themselves. By the mid-2000s, the gold and silver pawn shop had survived what it was never supposed to survive. It had outlasted bad years, bad markets, bad luck, and the private turbulence of a man who never stopped pushing even when pushing cost him something irreplaceable. The cameras were getting closer. Rick Harrison did not know it yet, but the world was about to discover what the streets of Las Vegas already knew: that the man behind that counter was unlike anyone television had ever seen. Nobody in television saw it coming. In 2009, the History Channel was not known for making stars. It was known for documentaries about wars, ancient civilizations, and the slow machinery of historical events. It was not the network anyone would have chosen to launch a cultural phenomenon. And yet, when cameras first rolled inside the gold and silver pawn shop on Las Vegas Boulevard, something happened that network executives had not fully predicted and could not entirely explain. America could not look away. Pawn Stars debuted on July 19, 2009, and within weeks, it became the highest-rated series in the History Channel's existence. Not because of special effects or scripted drama, not because of celebrities or manufactured conflict, but because of something far rarer and far more difficult to manufacture on television: authenticity. Rick Harrison was not performing. He was simply being the man he had spent 40 years becoming: the negotiator, the historian, the reader of people and objects and situations, the man who had stood behind that counter through bad years and good, through personal collapse and stubborn reconstruction, and had come out the other side knowing things that most people his age had never bothered to learn. Viewers sensed it immediately. When Rick picked up a Civil War rifle or a Roman coin or a piece of Americana that had traveled a century to reach his counter, the knowledge behind his eyes was not rehearsed. It was real. The experts he called in were real. The deals were real. And the family dynamic: his father, the old man, his son, Corey, and the perpetually enthusiastic Chumley, was so genuinely, comfortably, almost chaotically real that it made every polished reality show surrounding it look hollow by comparison. By 2011, Pawn Stars was averaging over 7 million viewers per episode. The gold and silver became one of the most visited tourist destinations in Las Vegas, drawing crowds that lined up around the block for a chance to stand where they had watched Rick stand on their television screens. The shop that had once struggled to survive the month was now generating millions. The man who had dropped out of high school at 17 was being interviewed by publications that had once ignored him entirely. But Rick Harrison had been in enough rooms to know exactly what sudden fame cost and what it concealed. Behind the cameras, the schedule was merciless. Filming consumed the shop in ways that complicated the actual business of running it. Real transactions became tangled with production schedules. The line between the authentic world Rick had built and the televised version of it blurred in ways that occasionally unsettled him. He later admitted that there were moments when he walked through his own shop and felt like a guest in someone else's story. The fame also brought scrutiny of a particular kind. Critics who had never set foot in a pawn shop wrote pieces questioning whether the deals were staged. Competitors dismissed the show as entertainment, masquerading as expertise. And the internet, with its endless appetite for contradiction, picked apart every negotiation, every valuation, every casual remark made under lights that were now impossible to escape. So Rick responded the way he had always responded to skepticism, with knowledge, with patience, and with the quiet confidence of a man who understood that those who talk the loudest about a subject are rarely the ones who understand it deepest. The show ran, season after season. The numbers held. The phenomenon did not fade the way most television phenomena do, and in its success, Rick Harrison became something he had never quite anticipated. Not just a television personality, not just a successful businessman, but a symbol of a particular kind of American story. The dropout who outread the graduates. The man who found value where others found clutter. The son who turned his father's modest gamble into a global brand. His estimated net worth climbed past $10 million. Then further. His face appeared on merchandise, on billboards, on the screens of people in countries where Las Vegas existed only as an idea. The gold and silver pawn shop became as recognizable a Las Vegas landmark as anything the casinos had built with their billions. Yet Rick Harrison, standing in the middle of all of it, remained unsettled in ways the cameras never quite captured. Because fame, as Simon Cowell once learned under very different lights, has a way of illuminating everything you have built, while simultaneously casting the deepest shadow over everything you have lost. And Rick Harrison had losses that no camera would ever be permitted to follow. Fame has a way of arriving just as the people who needed you most have already learned to live without you. By the time Pawn Stars turned Rick Harrison into a household name, his sons were no longer small children waiting by the door. They were young men who had grown up watching their father pour everything he had into a business that demanded everything he had. The shop had always come first, not because Rick was indifferent to fatherhood, but because a man holding a business together with stubbornness and sheer will rarely has the luxury of putting it second. Corey Harrison had grown up inside the gold and silver the way other children grow up inside their father's shadows. Present, watching, absorbing. He appeared on Pawn Stars from its earliest episodes, a young man trying to establish his own authority inside a space that would always carry his father's name first. The dynamic between them on screen was warm, occasionally combative, and unmistakably real. But off-camera, the relationship carried the particular tension that exists between fathers who built something from nothing and sons who inherited both the blessing and the burden of that something. Rick admitted in later interviews that he had not always been the father he intended to be. The hours the shop demanded, the years of financial uncertainty, the eventual avalanche of television production, each of these had taken time that could not be reclaimed. He had been present in the building. He had not always been present in the room. It is the quiet distinction that ambitious men spend the second half of their lives reckoning with. His second marriage to Tracy had provided a period of structure and stability that the family genuinely needed. Jake, his youngest son, grew up in a household that was more settled than the one Corey and Adam had known. But even that marriage could not withstand the gravitational pull of a man whose identity was inseparable from his work. The relationship eventually ended, adding another chapter to a personal history that Rick spoke about rarely and only with the measured honesty of someone who had made peace with his own imperfection. He married a third time, to Deanna Burdett, in 2013, in a ceremony that Pawn Stars cameras were invited to film. It was a moment of genuine happiness. He and those who knew him well noted that Deanna brought a steadiness to his personal life that the years of building and surviving had not always allowed. But even within that happiness, the pattern held. The shop, the show, the schedule, the relentless machinery of an empire that had taken decades to build and could not simply be paused because a man had finally found peace at home. Rick Harrison had become, in the truest sense, a man divided. On one side, the public figure. Confident, knowledgeable, the negotiator who never flinched, who could assess a Roman artifact and a person's desperation with equal precision, and who had turned that particular skill into something the entire world wanted to watch. On the other side, the private man. Quieter, more uncertain, carrying the accumulated weight of marriages that had not survived his ambition, of children who had grown up in the long shadow of a father who was always, in some essential way, already somewhere else. The fame complicated things further. Corey's own struggles with weight and health became tabloid fodder. Chum Lee, the fan favorite whose warmth had made him one of the show's most beloved figures, faced serious legal troubles that Rick was forced to navigate both personally and professionally. Every private difficulty that touched anyone connected to the gold and silver was now a story the public felt entitled to consume. Rick bore it with the same composure he brought to every difficult negotiation. Outwardly steady, inwardly calculating the cost. While he spoke more honestly about fatherhood as the years passed, and the cameras became a permanent feature of his existence. He acknowledged that building something from nothing required a particular kind of selfishness. Not the cruel kind, but the relentless kind. The kind that keeps a man at his desk when his children are asleep and returns him home when they are already awake and no longer waiting. "You cannot build what I built," he once said quietly, "without losing things along the way." The question is whether what you built was worth what you lost. And I am still not entirely sure I know the answer. It was the most unguarded thing he had ever said in public, and it landed with the weight of a man who had negotiated thousands of deals across a glass counter and understood, finally, that the most important transactions in a life are rarely the ones conducted in business. They are the ones conducted in kitchens, in hospital waiting rooms, at school plays attended or missed, in the small, uncelebrated moments that accumulate into either a life well lived or a life well documented. Rick Harrison had documented his extraordinarily well, whether he had lived it the way he would have chosen. That was the question the cameras could never answer for him. There are things that fame cannot protect you from. Rick Harrison learned this not once, but twice, in ways that no negotiation, no expertise, and no accumulated fortune could soften. The first loss arrived in June 2018. Richard Harrison Sr., the old man, died at the age of 77. To the millions who had watched Pawn Stars, he was the lovable, unhurried patriarch behind the counter. The man who shuffled through the shop with the quiet authority of someone who had earned the right to move at his own pace. The one whose dry humor and genuine warmth had become as much a part of the show's identity as the deals themselves. But to Rick, he was something far more essential than a television character. He was the man who had opened a pawn shop on a rough stretch of Las Vegas Boulevard and handed his dropout son a counter to stand behind when the world had already written that son off. He was the discipline and the stubbornness and the belief that hard work, applied consistently and without complaint, was the only philosophy a man truly needed. He was, in every way that mattered, the foundation on which Rick Harrison had built everything. When the old man died, Rick stepped away from cameras and public life without announcement or explanation. Those closest to him described a man hollowed by grief in ways that the usual armor of competence and composure could not conceal. He had spent decades negotiating across a counter from people carrying loss. Now the loss was entirely his own, and there was no expertise in the world that could assign it a value or tell him what it was worth. He returned. He always returned. But those who knew him well noted that something had shifted permanently behind his eyes, a quietness that had not been there before, a patience that grief sometimes carves into people whether they ask for it or not. Then came January 2024, and the loss that broke something deeper still. Adam Harrison, Rick's second son, died at the age of 39. The cause was an accidental fentanyl overdose, a crisis that has consumed American families across every income level, every zip code, every category of privilege and struggle that a country can produce. It does not discriminate, it does not negotiate, and it does not care how recognizable a family's name is. But Rick had watched Adam struggle, had tried, in the way that fathers try when trying is not enough, to intervene, to help, to pull someone back from a current that moves faster than love alone can swim against. The helplessness of watching a child suffer while possessing every resource except the one resource that actually matters, the ability to make someone choose differently, is a particular kind of torment that wealth makes no less cruel. When Adam died, Rick Harrison made a public statement that was brief and devastated. He asked for privacy. He received, for a time, the grace of people who understood that some grief belongs only to the people carrying it. But grief of that magnitude does not stay private forever. It surfaces in the pauses between sentences, and in the way a man looks when someone mentions his children, and he has to recalculate, in real time, how many he is answering for. In the heaviness that settles over a room when a subject is approached too closely, and the person inside it braces almost imperceptibly against the weight of it. Rick Harrison had survived financial collapse. He had survived the scrutiny of global fame. He had survived the physical demands of decades behind a counter and in front of cameras. He had endured the quiet erosion of marriages and the complicated distances of fatherhood divided by ambition. But the loss of Adam was different. It was the loss that does not resolve, the one that does not lead, eventually, to a chapter of rebuilding or reinvention. It simply remains, permanent, heavy, a room in the architecture of a life that stays dark no matter how brightly the rest of the house is lit. He kept working, because men like Rick Harrison do not know how to stop. Because the counter and the deals and the knowledge and the cameras had long since become the structure that held him upright when everything else gave way. But the man standing behind that counter in 2024 was carrying something that no camera in the gold and silver pawn shop had ever been equipped to capture. Rick Harrison turns 55 in 2025. Still standing behind the same counter where his story began. The gold and silver pawn shop is still there on Las Vegas Boulevard, still drawing crowds that line up in the Nevada heat for a chance to stand inside the place they watched on television. Pawn Stars is still filming. The History Channel is still broadcasting. The machinery of the empire Rick Harrison built from a high school dropout's refusal to accept the verdict the world had rendered on him continues to turn with the steady, unglamorous reliability of something built to last. But the man behind the counter has changed in ways that no camera fully captures. He moves differently now, more deliberately. The weight of 2 funerals, his father in 2018, his son Adam in 2024, has settled into his posture in the way that permanent grief always does, not breaking a man, but reshaping him, rounding the sharp edges, slowing the pace, teaching him, in the only language loss truly speaks, that the most valuable things a life contains are never the ones that can be placed behind glass and assigned a number. His fortune is estimated at over $10 million. The shop generates revenue that the desperate young man who stood behind that counter in 1988 could not have imagined. His face remains one of the most recognizable in American cable television history. The empire is intact, and yet Rick Harrison speaks now not of deals or ratings or the next season. He speaks of Corey, of Jake, of being present in the ways that building the empire never permitted him to be. He has said quietly that losing Adam taught him the one lesson that decades of negotiation somehow never had. That time, unlike everything else that passes through a pawn shop, cannot be bought back at any price. He still reads voraciously, still negotiates with the precision of a man who taught himself everything the system refused to teach him, still carries the particular confidence of someone who built something real from almost nothing and survived every attempt the world made to take it apart. But the hunger that once drove him, the relentless, forward-leaning urgency of a man proving something to a world that had underestimated him, has softened into something quieter and perhaps more enduring. Gratitude, presence, the hard-won understanding that legacy is not measured in what a man accumulates, but in what he chooses to protect. Behind every great fortune is a story most people never see. Behind Rick Harrison's is a boy with epilepsy and no diploma who refused, through bankruptcy and heartbreak and grief, and the relentless ordinary difficulty of a life fully lived, to stay invisible. The counter is still there. So is he.